Good morning, everyone. I'm Jude Doughty, and I welcome you to the 13th George Briscoe Kerferd Oration. I consider it to be a very great privilege to be part of the 13th Kerferd Oration. This particular one dedicated to considering the choices we make in our everyday lives, from what we buy, what we do, how we spend our resources and time, and particularly how we engage with others. Today, we have all chosen to spend this beautiful Sunday morning at the 13th Kerferd Oration, thinking about these choices and the ethics of invisible people. We thank you all for being here and consider every one of you at present a very special guest. I would, however, like to make particular mention of our orator, Dr. Simon Longstaff, AO, past orators, Ms Cathy McGowan, AO, MP, Federal Member for Indi, Dr Bill Wilson, APM, OAM. Our sponsor representatives from La Trobe University, Mark Engel, WA Credit Union, Peter Challis, and Indigo Shire councillors, Don Chambers, Jenny O'Connor, Peter Croucher, Roberta Horn, and Chief Executive Jerry Smith. Ian Smith, Chair of Beechworth Neighbourhood Centre, and of course the descendants of George Briscoe Kerferd, who I'll say a little bit more later on. Apologies have also been received from a number of community leaders across our region. You will have all read the notes in the program that outlines Dr. Longstaff's extraordinary contribution to public debate, both in Australia and internationally. In the Border Mail on Saturday the 11th of July, Dr. Longstaff throws the challenge to us all, saying, not only that have we as a society become too obedient, but in doing so we have rendered the most vulnerable in our community invisible. As an ethicist, Dr. Longstaff calls on us to examine why in our collective choice to become so obedient have we in fact allowed ourselves to pay attention to some people and not to others. Doing the right thing, he says, is not to turn away, leaving some people in our community invisible, but to ask the question of ourselves in everyday life. What is the right thing to do in this situation? Please welcome Dr. Simon Longstaff, AO, to deliver the 13th George Briscoe Kerferd Oration.
Well, my fellow citizens, woof to you too. Including all dogs. I actually make a reference later on, actually. A special note I've got for you, I'll draw your attention to it. All of the distinguished guests who were just mentioned, descendants of George Briscoe Kerferd, an extraordinary man who reinvented himself many, many times and seems to have bequeathed that capacity to the community of Beechworth itself, as I've noticed in the time that I've been here. And of course, everybody else in the room. May I begin by thanking the organisers of this oration for doing me the great honour of inviting me to join the role of the very distinguished speakers who precede me, and particularly single out Joan Sims and Michael Evans, who, with a number of other people, have put all of this together. And of course, it's an extraordinary turnout, as somebody said, to come and sit here on a Sunday morning when there are so many other things you could be doing, but to talk about ideas and to think about the role that we play in citizens and the quality of the democracy that we have created amongst ourselves. So it's a great honour and a great pleasure to be with you this morning, delivering some remarks that I hope will challenge and provoke conversation that goes well beyond the incident of this particular gathering. Now, unusually, I normally just speak from very brief notes, but on this occasion I was asked to prepare a more formal address, so I will be actually reading it, hopefully with a bit of life in what I have to say, but rather than just looking you in the eye all the way along, I'll have to glance down to the text as I go through, so please excuse that. In 1942, Sir Robert Menzies took to the airwaves to broadcast the first in a long series of weekly fireside chats in which he sought to set out the philosophical principles that might justify Australia's participation in the second great war that his generation had been called to fight. Menzies spoke to the nation from opposition, something extraordinary in itself. He did not resort to jingoism or to the use of three-word slogans. He did not appeal to jingoistic motives such as loyalty to empire or any of the other things that he might have done in such critical times. Instead, he sketched the boundaries of a different kind of territory, one defined by ideas, even by ideals, worth fighting for. He did not speak down to his audience. He did not presume that they were beyond understanding. Rather, he spoke as a fellow citizen and in a language that was simple but not simplistic. The series of broadcasts were, to a considerable degree, Sir Robert Menzies' public declaration of the principles on which the Liberal Party of Australia was to be founded. And in those days, and for Sir Robert, the Liberal Party was genuinely liberal, founded on traditions of liberty that generations of our forebears had shed copious blood to secure. Now, only the first of those 37 broadcasts was given under the specific title of The Forgotten People. Yet, when published as a whole, this was the title given to the whole collection. The potent idea that Menzies tapped into was that the middle class, what he called the salt of the earth, made up of the self-employed, shopkeepers, farmers and the like, was at risk of being set aside by the other great political movements. Labor had been established to protect and promote the interests of working folk, often exploited terribly by those with the means to do so. Australia's squattocracy, the Antipodean landed gentry and their wealthy commercial cousins in the metropolitan centres of power, were still able to control the levers of power and were assuredly able to look after themselves, which just left those in the middle, their interests unrepresented. And as much as anything else, Menzies' success was assured by his brilliance in giving these people a name, the forgotten people, an identity to which they might relate, and an organising principle for establishing a new political party to give them voice. Well, my task today is to do something similar, to give a name to the people who are not merely forgotten, but rendered invisible by a political system that has learned not to see many of its own citizens, and that has perfected the art of hiding away the uncomfortable truths of contemporary life. Today, I wish to speak of the invisible people, not with the intention of laying the foundation for a new political party, but perhaps in order to rouse the rebellious spirit of a nation that has allowed a small and self-perpetuating political class to hijack our democracy. Now, I want to propose three categories of invisibility within which we might be shrouded. First, there are the hidden, being those whom the powerful see but will not show, those who are hidden from the public gaze. Secondly, the ignored, being those whom the powerful see but will not recognise. And thirdly, the unseen, being those whom the powerful look at but cannot see. Before going on to explore each category, let me say something about what I really mean here by the powerful. In this case, I certainly mean those who wield public power, most notably politicians in general, and especially those in government, whatever their political persuasion. However, I'm also referring to those who run major institutions in the private and the public sectors, including the mainstream media in its various forms. And the media has a very important role to play in all of this. Finally, in terms of the powerful, I have in mind certain dominant ideas so familiar to us that they are routinely expressed without ever being challenged for either veracity or coherence. With luck, what I have in mind here will become clear as each section unfolds. So let me begin with the hidden, the first of my three categories of invisible people. There's something especially poignant about my making these observations here in Beechworth and on this particular site, the site of what once was an asylum, and of course within the larger community a former jail which has now been relocated, where so many people have actually been held in plain sight, whether for their own good or for the good of others. For here we are today, sitting atop a hill, perhaps the most prominent point in town. I don't know what exactly led George Briscoe Kerferd to support civic initiatives associated with this community, but I like to imagine that he felt that those needing asylum of whatever kind should neither be forgotten nor rendered invisible. Rather, I like to imagine that he hoped that the less fortunate might actually be held in mind, might be seen in the mind's eye of the public, hence the hill. Not so for those who cross other types of boundaries in the modern world. Secrecy and obfuscation have become common currency. For example, consider the case of those in need of asylum who seek refuge in Australia by boat. It's a contentious issue, and I know that there are people of good wills on both sides of the issue, including those who are genuinely motivated by a compassionate impulse to prevent avoidable deaths at sea. However, compassion is just not evident in a process that begins with refugees being cloaked in language that describes them as illegal asylum seekers. Now, the means they may employ to reach safety may be illegal. The people they pay to assist them may be criminals, notably of a kind who might allegedly enjoy the occasional Australian patronage from time to time. However, the point here is that genuine asylum seekers are not themselves illegal. When you seek asylum, objectively fleeing from persecution and oppression, it is not and cannot, under international law to which we are signatories, that cannot be illegal. Instead, the use of language of this kind is merely a device employed by politicians to hide the truth of the refugees' plight. And hide the truth they do. The operations to intercept asylum seekers are carried out in secret. The conditions in which they are detained are secret. And in fact, most recently, Parliament has enacted the Australian Border Force Act. Both major parties have supported it, so it's not about Liberal or National or Labor. They're all in this together. That, amongst other things, makes it an offence for a range of conscientious people, including medical practitioners, to disclose conduct that any reasonable person would deem to be wrong. Indeed, Australian governments are becoming obsessed with the need to hide away anything that might be for them either unpleasant or embarrassing. With increasing frequency, the need to preserve national security is invoked as a justification, when it can be a genuinely good argument from time to time, if applied with restraint. Unfortunately, governments of all political hues have no apparent inclination to exercise that degree of restraint. Instead, they now tend to make ambit claims for an extension of their powers, often again to be exercised in secret, and then they leave it to Parliament, a parliamentary committee, to claw back territory that should have always have been reserved for the liberty of citizens. Now, as noted above, not everyone who's hidden disappears behind physical walls. Sometimes they're rendered invisible by the application of rules and regulations or by verbal sleights of hand that, like a conjurer's trick, misdirect the public's attention, so much so as to cause us not to see what is actually right before our eyes. For example, a classic trick is to make the victims of misfortune seem to be the calculating authors of their own downfall. When done successfully, the true plight of people is hidden behind a veneer of blameworthiness. It's their fault. They put themselves in this situation. We do not need to see them as they truly are. In other cases, the suffering of our fellow citizens can be shrouded by institutional arrangements. For example, the general deference accorded to priests, along with an assumption of their moral superiority, counted against those who claim to have been sexually abused by members of the clergy. The victims were often rendered silent and invisible by a powerful and prestigious church hierarchy that could count on the community to discount the victim's claims, even when those claims were objectively true. Although different in their detail of their operation, similar forms of institutional shrouding have been applied by others. For example, the military, by university colleges, etc., in terms of covering up cases of bastardisation, by aged care facilities where the complaints of the elderly have been dismissed as just unreliable and so on. They don't really know, they don't really count. Now, it may be that governments and some even of these private institutions will respond by saying that their efforts to hide the distasteful and the troubling aspects of our imperfect society are less a matter of choice than a pragmatic response to the public's demand that they actually do so. They might claim that the community, that we, have actually little appetite for the inconvenient or uncomfortable truths. That we, us here, that we are in fact the grand masters of outsourcing our personal obligations to deal with the messier aspects of our shared humanity. In short, they might say that we are in fact happier not knowing. That's what we ask them to do. And as it happens, I actually think that there might be some justice to this response. As citizens, do we really wish to know what is done in our name? Do we really wish to be exposed to the whole spectrum of issues that make up the fabric of our society? Or is there some consolation to be found in the maintenance of an environment of plausible deniability? If so, then do we collude with governments that keep hidden what might otherwise disturb our collective peace of mind? And my hunch is that both of these forces are at work here. On the one hand, in governments enjoy a fair measure of shelter from public scrutiny, as too much transparency might expose areas of weakness that might count against their re-election. Additionally, having contended for power, many government ministers chafe at the limitations imposed on their freedom of action, limitations often linked to regimes of accountability and transparency. Likewise, I think that the community is all too often happy enough to live in conditions of strategic ignorance, so that we can awake to moments of righteous indignation when there is no more hiding from the darker secrets of our society. We've seen this happen time and time again, not least in relation to the treatment of Indigenous people, or of children abused by Christian clerics, or of the men and women of the Australian Defence Force who, having been exposed to humanity's greatest horrors, have at least in the past been utterly abandoned to cope alone with post-traumatic stress disorders. And I've seen this up firsthand, particularly amongst those who were at Kabayo in Rwanda, who I've dealt with in a force protection unit, and they were just basically dumped here, sent back to their units without support. That's the sort of thing that, joins an extraordinarily long list of cases of that kind. And all of this leads me to ask if we have actually got the stomach as a people to know the truth, the whole truth, the good and the bad about the condition of our society. Do we have the courage to insist on knowing, to insist that we be able to see what is done in our name? More controversially, does government have an obligation to ensure that we know the truth, even if we do not wish to do so? Should politicians accept the political risk of holding up a mirror to society, even if we condemn them for doing so? Now, the second of my categories is the ignored. This second category of invisible people, of whom I wish to speak, are the people who are seen, that is, who are evidently present to government and to the larger public mind, but who count for so little as simply to be ignored. Unfortunately, this has become part and parcel of the world of professional politics, where the political gaze has become increasingly partial. Rather than looking for and seeing every citizen as a person of intrinsic value, the logic of political calculation draws the politician's eye towards those most able to affect their political fortunes. And perhaps it was ever so. However, the refinement of the techniques used to identify voter preferences, polls and focus groups and things like that, what they've done is that they've allowed politicians to achieve a laser-like focus on key constituents on whom their power ultimately relies. This tendency is not restricted in its application to the wider Australian electorate. The experience of vulnerable political leaders in both major parties has led their successors to spend a considerable amount of time managing their personal power base within their respective party rooms, often adopting policies to satisfy people in their party rooms that are clearly at odds with majority opinion of the Australian community. Now, the latest example of this phenomenon can be seen in the Prime Minister's experience, that is, of the experience of Mr Abbott, who, having survived a near-death experience in the party room, is working hard to keep close to the Conservative base on which his premiership depends. When the threat looms so large as it did for him, and at such close quarters, it takes a truly remarkable leader to look beyond the parapets and to see the larger community that is standing quietly hopeful just outside the castle gates. Now, that the partial gaze of politicians is inexorably drawn to the bright spots of political opportunity means that those living in political black spots are just often overlooked. And ironically, that this means that those who are actually based in safe seats can be at a relative disadvantage, at least when compared to those based in marginal seats. Likewise, the relatively low population density that is typical of rural and regional electorates means that the interests of their citizens can be discounted in comparison to those of people living in the dense, contiguous electorates located in the metropolitan areas. Indeed, it's an extraordinary achievement of country people that they've managed to amplify their voice, often through an appeal to emotion, to history, to culture, so as to have a disproportionately large impact on national politics. And in some senses, this is despite the alliance between the National and Liberal parties, the effect of which is, more often than not, to limit the scope of the National Party to give full-throated voice to the concerns of country people. And we've seen this process at work in the recent outpouring from the people of the Liverpool Plains, who feel betrayed by politicians whom they judge either to be unwilling or unable to place the community's interests ahead of those of some local miners. And it's beyond me. I genuinely don't know whether or not the economic utility derived from mining the coal adjacent to the Liverpool Plains' rich farmland and vital aquifers is sufficient to justify the risks. What I do know is the hard truth that the farmers and their allies are not believed to carry a large enough political stick. And only time will tell if that belief is well founded. And finally, there's this tendency in the midst of deeply partisan politics to divide the world into friend or foe. And it troubles me that the current political environment is one in which it's all too easy to fall into the category of foe, simply for failing to give wholehearted allegiance to one party or another. If you're not totally on board, then you must be totally against us. In that sense, I suppose that the vast majority of us who think about things and maybe are not totally committed to one side or the other, we're going to be considered to be foes of one side or another, of one political leader or another. And the fact that even the slightest expression of doubt or criticism can cast you into the enemy camp should trouble us all, because it's becoming clear that modern government is ready to dismiss their opponents as irrelevant, as un-Australian, or worse. And the dismissal of critics is often done with utter disdain. Unfortunately, this all-or-nothing approach of our political leaders has conditioned the tone of debate in the wider community. It seems to me that that reason itself has given way to invective, and that the champions of political correctness that used to dominate are now matched by the foot soldiers of conservative correctness. Both groups, both sides, claim to champion freedom of speech, and both groups will rush to shut down anyone who dissents from their prevailing orthodoxy. They'll boycott, they will bully their ideological opponents to a point where each side's partisans and the increasingly disengaged public simply tune out and ignore the participants. Each inevitably becomes invisible to the other. Now, if you accept my proposition that the political gaze is essentially partial and narrow, and that it fails and falls only where opportunity lies, then what are we to do? Well, I want to propose that the solution lies in a reappraisal of the role of the public service, especially in terms of its duty to the community as a whole. It used to be that the public service conceived of itself as being bound by obligations that exist at least apart from those that are derived from the obligations of government ministers. And it's not an especially radical concept I'm proposing here. For example, all sworn police officers exercise what is known as the original authority of the constable. This original authority exists in order to ensure that the police enforce the law in relation to all persons, irrespective of their wealth and power. That is, the constable, and this is an ancient obligation, upholds the rule of law even if government ministers direct them to behave otherwise. Now, the change in the culture of Australian public service organisations was actually driven by reforms introduced by the Whitlam government onwards, with significant structural changes being introduced by Labor and coalition governments, with especially notable reforms being introduced by the Howard government, building on work instituted under Hawke and Keating. And one of the dominant themes underpinning reform was the need to ensure that the Australian public service was responsive, as they said, to the agenda of the elected government of the day. To that end, significant reforms were designed to ensure that public service would serve the government of the day. Although this direction was accompanied by formal pronouncements intended to reinforce the need for political neutrality across the public service, the practical effect of the reforms was, in the eyes of many, to politicise the public service, or at least its most senior ranks, thus moving it away from the traditions embodied in the British Westminster system and towards those of the United States of America, where senior public servants are traditionally replaced with each change of administration. For example, 6 departmental secretaries were replaced with the election of the Howard government in 1996, with at least 2 of them being replaced as a result of being judged as too close to the political interests of the former government. Now, as noted above, I don't think that the authors of these reforms intended that the Australian public service should become politicised, at least not to the extent that has occurred in some jurisdictions. The problem is that the emphasis on the need to serve the government of the day was actually not balanced by a discussion of any residual obligation that might be owed directly to us as citizens. With this in mind, I want to make the potentially controversial suggestion that the duty owed to the government of the day is actually qualified by a more fundamental obligation to the citizens of a democracy. It's often forgotten that democracy is itself distinguished from other political systems by the fact that the ultimate source of political authority is located in the persons of the governed, in us. Sometimes we call it the people, but it's us. That's where all political authority ultimately comes from. Other political systems locate ultimate authority in other places. A theocracy, ultimate authority in God. A plutocracy, ultimate authority in the wealthy. A meritocracy in the able. Only a democracy accords such a critical role to its citizens. So going back to Menzies, he observed in 1942, of all the laws, that of the Constitution is at once the most fundamental and the most sacred. Parliaments may tell us from day to day what we are to do or not to do. The parliaments themselves are controlled by the Constitution, which is not their servant, but on the contrary, their master. And here's the kicker. Neither Parliament nor government can alter it. Only the people can do that. They were its creators 40 years ago, and they, that is us, we are its masters still. Now, the implications of this are far-reaching. For example, it follows from this that no government may deny its citizens the means by which they might actively participate in democratic life. With this in mind, There are minimal levels of health, minimal levels of education, minimal levels of security and other basic goods that are required by citizens if they are able to exercise their basic rights as citizens. As such, any government that denies such basic goods to some or all of its citizens will fail in its most basic duty to those who are the source of its authority. And it's my argument that the public service must not become complicit in the denial of such goods, even when demanded of it by a government claiming the legitimacy of a democratic mandate. That is, I want to propose that public servants have an original authority, going back to the Constitution and the source of authority from which that is derived, that might mirror that of the original authority of a constable. Now, this is not meant to suggest that the public service can impose its own view on what makes for a good life. It must be generally responsive to every elected government, whatever its political orientation. However, the one thing that the public service may not do, is accept the partial gaze of its political masters. Rather, the public service must look for and see every single citizen in an equal light, irrespective of who they are, irrespective of where they happen to live. There can be no dark corners, there can be no zones of irrelevance. No citizen should ever be ignored simply because they're not thought to count for much in the calculation of party politics. Now, this brings me to the final category of invisible people, those who are unseen. In many respects, this is the most troubling category of all. While it's galling to be hidden away or to be seen but ignored, it's an assault on our basic dignity to be not seen at all. And it's a serious point here that the concept of intrinsic dignity is central to the development of Western ethics. It's got both religious and secular roots. The religious tradition accords fundamental dignity to all as being made in the image of God. The old Hebrew idea is not that humanity is made in the physical image of God, but instead the moral image as beings endowed with free will, an essential property of God. The secular story has various trajectories, perhaps best captured in the work of Immanuel Kant, who argued that the human capacity for reason places all persons within what he called the kingdom of ends. Translated into ordinary language, the kingdom of ends is a category of beings, typically human beings like us, that may never be used simply as another person's tool. They may not be considered just another resource to be deployed for the benefit of another. Thus, the discomfort of many people with the term human resources. Given this, it's actually a profound insult to ethics, not to be seen. And in many respects, this has been the plight, for example, of Indigenous people in the period since European settlement of Australia. The worst of what was done to them involved a denial of their equal humanity, leading to the development of policies that were consciously indifferent to their survival as a distinct people. In language that is hard to credit in the modern age, colonial administrators were entirely candid about their hope that Indigenous people would one day not be a discernible part of the Australian environment. Indeed, it's telling that a number of states had classified Aboriginal people and dealt with them under legislation about flora and fauna. That's where you would find it. Now, one of the most important things about the apology delivered by Kevin Rudd is that it finally established that Indigenous people were equal to all others, with the recognition of that reality being expressed in the idea that they were actually deserving of an apology. One does not apologise to a wombat or to a roo, no matter how wrong they may be. We reserve apologies for other persons, our ethical equals. Now, the fact that we might recognise the wrongs of the past, or for the present for that matter, does not mean that we must also conclude that the perpetrators of these things were in any way bad people. As it happens, the more I see of the world, the more I am convinced that most bad things are actually done by good people. I extend this concession to our political leaders, indeed to the vast majority of people who from time to time cause harm within the world. The trouble is that they genuinely do not see that what they do is wrong. In that sense, they suffer from a kind of ethical blindness that can extend so far as to their not seeing the people whose interests are most affected by their conduct. The idea of not seeing is actually central to the work of the Ethics Centre, particularly the work we've been doing for years now with the Australian Defence Force. One of the things we do is that we work with the pre-deployment of all Australian forces before they're being posted overseas to places like Iraq and Afghanistan. And it's not the place here really to go into the reasons for this work being done, but it's to do with the particular problems of asymmetric warfare. Except to note that in most general terms, the ADF has developed a doctrine that actually conceives of leadership as an ethical practice, something that is essential when operating in these conditions of asymmetric warfare. So before returning to this notion of not seeing, let me say that our work with the ADF has given rise to this concept called the tiger in the room. Now, we're all familiar with the idea of an elephant in the room, a visible risk that we can all see but that we do not name. The tiger in the room is far more dangerous. It's the risk that remains unseen because everyone has been conditioned by training, habit, experience to see only the greens in the jungle environment and nothing of the orange that defines the tiger's presence. The trouble is that if you cannot see all the colours of the spectrum, then tigers become almost invisible. And I actually picked up on this idea at Taronga Zoo, where they had this screen over the glass in the cage where the tigers were. And they're wandering along there, and when they come behind the screen, it removes orange from the spectrum. It's basically like seeing in black and white, and they really do become invisible if you can't see orange. And lots of people spend their whole life learning to see every shade of green. They just don't learn to see orange because it doesn't fit their professional training or their worldview. And nature refuses to be tamed by our ignorance of it, and the tiger gets you. So people who've learned not to see orange suffer a terrible fate when the tiger springs, as do all others who happen to be in the wrong place at the wrong time. Unfortunately, we live in a world where large numbers of people learn only to see within the part of that spectrum with which they are familiar. So it is that when you ask people why they have done something that they now clearly see to be wrong, they'll tell you honestly that they just didn't see it at the time. And you ask why they didn't see it, and they say, well, because everyone was doing it. Well, that's just the way things are done, or were done. We just didn't see it. And they're telling you the truth. Conditioned blindness of this kind can affect anyone. It's remarkably easy to become locked within your own limited view of the world, especially when that view of the world is being reinforced by a larger group. It's in these circumstances that people who do not fit into our worldview can disappear from view. And before we know it, they've become a kind of social roadkill, run down by a society that's full of regrets once the body is found, but excuses the accident on the basis that the victim was unseen. As noted above, it's easy enough not to see people if they fall outside our definitions of worth or merit. Let me give an example of how we only see what we value. As I speak, there's a fixed number of lights in this room illuminating this place. They could be counted, and someone who did would be in possession of an objective fact about the world. It'd be rather bizarre if you did count all the lights when you came in, but it's certainly possible. However, I hope that no one has actually counted all the light bulbs here on today, because that fact, even though it is objectively there, just doesn't matter. The fact about the number of lights is there, but it's actually unseen. Just let me check, has anybody actually counted the light bulbs? No? Good. Now, let's see, count, right. I'm not going to ask you again, so I don't think you have to do it. There's no trick in this. Now, imagine that you are a person who matters so little as to be there, but to be unseen. Imagine that your predicament is not an accident, but the product of a deliberate decision to put you out of view. I noted at an earlier point today when speaking of asylum seekers that language can be key to this process. The famous author and essayist George Orwell made a particular study of the way in which politicians can divert us from seeing what is really there, what is actually there to be seen. At its most cynical, political language can be used to subvert the basic meaning of things, such as when legislation is given a title that implies the actual opposite of what is being enacted. But let me make this point with the first of two quotations that I wish to draw on today from the poetry of William Blake. And I resort to poetry in recollection of what I was once told when I was in the United States by an American who routinely attended poetry readings. I asked him, why do you go to poetry readings? And he said, Simon, it's the only time you ever hear the truth. So to Blake. Compel the poor to live upon a crust of bread by soft, mild arts. Smile when they frown when they smile, and when a man looks pale with labour and abstinence, say he looks healthy and happy. And when his children sicken, let them die. There are enough born, even too many, and our earth will be overrun without these arts. If you would make the poor live with temper, with pomp give every crust of bread you give, with gracious cunning magnify small gifts. Reduce the man to want a gift, and then give with pomp. Say he smiles if you hear him sigh, if pale, say he is ruddy. Preach temperance. Say he is overgorged and drowns his wit in strong drink, though you know that bread and water are all he can afford. Flatter his wife. Pity his children till we can reduce all to our will as spaniels are taught with art. There's the reference for the dog. Woof. So, if you listen to Blake's language there, beware the language of the powerful, because it can blind us and them to what really matters. I'd offer as one example a recent conversation I had with a government minister. This gentleman was genuinely proud when he told me that he and the government within which he served were committed to treating me as a customer. I think that he expected me to be pleased by this attribution. Instead, I reacted really badly. I said I was not a customer. I am a citizen. The minister challenged me with a response. He said, but there's no difference. As you might imagine, that was like waving a red flag at a bull, and I was off. I pointed out that my relationship with him was not defined by transactions that I performed. Instead, he needed to understand that as a citizen in a democracy, I joined with others, with all of you, in being the authors of every shred of authority he exercised. As a citizen, I mattered, irrespective of whether or not I brought or received a single government service. Now, I hope you can see in this exchange how easy it is to become invisible to government. All you need to do is to stop being a customer. However, this is not really, I hear, about the failings of government. Again, I think we need to look a bit closer to home. We need to ask ourselves what other descriptions lead people to disappear, not only from the view of government, but also from the view of the community as a whole. For example, do we disappear when we fall outside the ranks of the deserving poor? Do we disappear when our affliction is of a kind that is too frightening to be recognised, as was the case for those suffering mental illness in the past, and perhaps to a lesser degree in the present? Are there some types of human failing that we find it impossible to comprehend or cope with? So we block out these unfortunates who find themselves in this predicament. So where does this leave us? What kind of polity might we aspire to be? I believe that we need to re-examine and recall the philosophical foundations of our great liberal democracy. It's only if we truly understand the roots of the democratic tree that we can ensure that it flourishes. That's why the ideas of men like Sir Robert Menzies were so important.
His democratic vision was grounded in the ideas of philosophers like John Locke, who took seriously the idea that there are certain inalienable freedoms that placed the citizen and not the government at the centre of democratic life. And Menzies was not alone in mastering ideas and a form of democratic politics that spoke to the better aspirations of the people. There was a whole generation of politicians from those right across the political spectrum who knew from hard-won experience that some values and principles actually transcend political differences, and who shared a general ideal of what a good life in a good society might be. Where they differed was in relation to the means by which such a society might be obtained. And that's the ground on which they fought their political battles, promoting positive programs with conviction and arguments drawn from principle. And I remember when I was up in Thailand at Hellfire Pass listening to the audio that accompanies there. I was there on a magical morning before it was open to the public, walking those couple of kilometres of absolutely chilling place. If any of you have been there, you'll know what it means. And in the audio, you have the voice of Tom Uren, who's a far-left socialist, and Sir John Carrick, who was one of the founders of the Liberal Party, both speaking about their experience, reduced to the core of their being by what the Japanese did there. And they knew that some things mattered more than just getting a gotcha moment or scoring a political win. Where's that gone? Where's it gone? Anyway, let's not be driven by nostalgia for an Australia that was, no doubt, both better and probably worse than we might remember. Australia today has its own unique challenges. One of those is to share an ideal of the good society that embraces every citizen, irrespective of their religious or cultural orientation. This is the genius embedded in the idea of the secular state, an idea that is at risk of being whittled away by those who are both driving and opposing the forces of extremism. Now, the secular state is actually not hostile to religion, and secular does not mean atheist. Rather, the secular state neither condemns nor promotes religion. Ideally, it's entirely indifferent to private religious belief. Instead, the secular state seeks to promote a form of civic virtue derived from secular philosophical foundations. Such a framework will often have elements that are found within most religious moralities. However, it will not, and importantly, it must not be derived from them. So a secular state will afford a safe and respectful place for people of all faiths and of none. Indeed, it's only a secular state that can offer a coherent response to the problem of extremism, especially extremism of a kind grounded in religious belief. Any response that draws explicitly to any degree on a religious foundation, on an alternative religious foundation, will be taken as anathema by those to whom it is directed. That's why it's entirely counterproductive when politicians and pundits bang on about how Western liberal democracy is rooted in its Judeo-Christian heritage, somewhat overlooking the contribution of pagan Greeks and Romans, let alone the great thinkers of the Islamic world, all of whom translated this for us. If Australia is to counter the allure of the radicals, then it needs an open, coherent and secular ethical framework within which particularly young people can engage. In doing so, those at risk of radicalisation might avoid the nihilism and disaffection that fundamentalists, and they're religious fundamentalists, political ones, all sorts, that they so easily exploit with their siren songs of simple certainty, surrender and obedience, and do so without disturbing less destructive religious sensibilities. Now, there are some people who rail against the Enlightenment and its enhancement and its enthronement of reason over belief. They trace all that is bad in society back to the loss of religious authority. They're wrong, as all are their assertions that ethics are impossible without a religious foundation. Simply wrong. It's not true. It's quite possible to derive a fully functional ethical system in support of liberal democracy from entirely uncontroversial, this-worldly foundations. Such a system need not be hostile to religious belief. It simply does not depend on it, and it is, like the secular state itself, open to people of all faiths or none. So my first proposal for a positive way forward is that we actually relearn and re-engage with the lessons of the past, embracing and refreshing core ideas that should ground our modern political culture. But this will not be enough to solve the problem of the invisible people. For that to happen, we'll need a different kind of politics that is as much about us as it is about the politicians who come from our ranks. So let me set the challenge by returning to William Blake, again from the Four Zoas. What is the price of experience? Do men buy it for a song or wisdom for a dance in the street? No. It is bought with the price of all that a man hath, his house, his wife, his children. Wisdom is sold in the desolate market where none come to buy, and in the withered field where the farmer ploughs for bread in vain. It's an easy thing to triumph in the summer's sun and in the vintage, and to sing on the wagon loaded with corn. It's an easy thing to talk of patience to the afflicted, to speak the laws of prudence to the houseless wanderer, to listen to the hungry raven's cry in wintry season, when the red blood is filled with wine and with the marrow of lambs. It's an easy thing to laugh at wrathful elements, to hear the dog howl at the wintry door, the ox in the slaughterhouse moan, to see a God on every wind and a blessing on every blast, to hear sounds of love in the thunderstorm that destroys our enemy's house, to rejoice in the blight that covers his field and the sickness that cuts off his children, while our olive and vines sing and laugh around our door, and our children bring fruits and flowers. Then the groan and the dollar are quite forgotten, and the slave grinding at the mill, and the captive in chains, and the poor in the prison, and the soldier in the field when the shattered bone has laid him groaning among the happier dead. It's an easy thing to rejoice in the tents of prosperity. Thus could I sing and thus rejoice, but it is not so with me. No, it's not so with me. I doubt that it is so with you, my fellow citizens. I, for one, yearn for a politics that speaks to our better nature. Instead, we're just typically served up a political diet that assumes that the worst in our nature will prevail. The appeal is made to our capacity for greed and fear, or we're asked to buy into a politics of exclusion in which we are made one by defining those who are other. Now, I realise that the alternative form of politics based on inclusion is more difficult to practice. However, I think that Australia lives in hope that such a politics might emerge. Is it really so hard to offer the community prosperity without appealing to personal greed? Or to offer security without appealing to our collective fears? Could we not imagine a political settlement that extends across party lines and might offer a positive vision of what this wonderful country might be? Unfortunately, I doubt that the current crop of political leaders can even imagine such a politics. They complain of volatility in the electorate. I don't see a community that is volatile like they think. I see a community that has a settled view of what it wants. It's just that we can't find it amongst the major parties and the political class that make up their dwindling numbers. Disappointed, we're casting about for alternatives. Well, the good news is that this is exactly as it should be. As I've stressed today, democratic government is not something which is handed down to us by politicians. It's something we make and claim for ourselves. And I expect that this simple truth is already at work within rural and regional Australia, places where the bonds of community are naturally stronger due to the fact that nothing much gets done unless people come together for mutual support and shared benefit. Country Australia might be just the place to create a new movement of Australians who demand that they be seen, who demand that they be heard, and who champion the idea that in Australia there should be no invisible people. Thank you.
Thank you, Simon. Simon will now take questions. We have some roving mics, 3 roving mics. Michael will have one, Ross and Ian. Do ask, when you ask a question, that you give your name, and we do ask that it be brief and that it be your question be in fact a question. I know that there will be lots of questions. So, question from here.
Kate Sutherland. I'm just wanting to know whether you'll work with the likes of Alan Jones, who have hold a big sway over community attitudes.
Alan Jones? I don't work with Alan Jones. Well, we have an interesting history. He deeply loathed me for many years because I was involved in the Cash for Comments moment when he was called to account, and 2UE invited me with a couple of others to look at what had happened. And no, he didn't like me at all. But we met one day, and I remember walking in and he said, so you're Simon Longstaff. But to be fair to him, since then there have been a couple of areas where he has been supportive of stuff we've done, particularly about introducing ethics classes into New South Wales state primary schools for kids who don't go to Scripture. And there are things where I think his own deep commitments, including what's happening in relation to the Liverpool Plains at the moment, go back to growing up on the Dowling Downs in Queensland. So there are some things which he says which are really appalling. There are other things which he says which I agree with, but he doesn't seek my counsel, and I'm not really in a position of offering it unless I'm asked, so there's not a lot to answer there.
Anne Threadgold. My paid employment is with the homeless and risk of homelessness people, and from my experience, people don't understand that they're sometimes within a couple of steps of becoming homeless, so it can happen to many people. And when I'm in the cities, in Melbourne or Sydney, you see the homeless people and people just walk past, or they might throw a coin, but they don't acknowledge the people on the pavement as being people. So what would you recommend that how people treat those who are at risk of homelessness or who are homeless?
Well, the first thing I'd say is that it's important that we think about what we mean by saying they're homeless, because sometimes I think as a society we believe that the solution to homelessness is to provide a shelter. There's a big difference between a shelter and a home. Shelter is a kind of a cover that keeps you dry and perhaps warm, and it's essential that it be there. But a home is so much more than that. It's a sense of place and where you can have some of your identity expressed and things like that. So that's the first thing just to note, that I don't know if we actually think enough about what the solutions are to meet the real need. The second thing is I think it's by the telling of stories. So often if you ever meet somebody and hear their story and see them then as a fully enfleshed person, that you can relate to them. While they're just a category or a stereotype, it's easy to discount their humanity and walk past because of the inconvenience it involves. And of course, we then start, I think there's a tendency to be suspicious if it's the same people in the same place doing the same things. That why hasn't something happened? And is it their fault? Is it a choice or whatever? So I really don't know the precise answer, except to think that the more you find by way of personal engagement and experience in hearing those stories, the more likely you'll just hear a narrative that you can relate to. And if those stories are able better to be told, I think that would make a difference.
I'm Mike Byrne. I just wondered how optimistic you were, or you are now, and whether you could put a time frame on this change that we're hoping for.
Well, look, I've talked about this in public quite a bit. Anybody here from Yak? What a great story, Yak and the service station. Yeah, that is such a cool story. You know, the service station's going to disappear, the community says, no, we're not going to wait for government or somebody else to do something about it, we're going to take it over, we're going to fix it up, we're going to have a store, and there it's operating. I think that's why this part of the world, and I don't know how much it's replicated in other parts of rural and regional Australia,
that makes me really optimistic. Because if people are prepared then to reclaim for themselves their society, their democracy, and insist upon it, that those who seek election actually engage, not just with us as an amorphous mass, but with each of us as individual citizens, I think that can make a really big difference. So I believe that I'm seeing pretty much all over the country a search, as I say, for something better. I don't think people are going to give up on it. I mean, I know some people disengage, and it's tragic. In fact, the figures about people between the ages of 18 and 24 are troubling, that they're questioning whether democracy is actually a system which they can invest in to give solutions. But I prefer to maintain an optimistic outlook. And I think that, you know, wherever you look, we will bring something forth. I don't know what it is. It might be a different model. It might be something stronger than independents, looser than parties. It might be charter groups. I just don't know what it is. But I like to believe that that movement, which could be ignited within rural and regional Australia, would then create a base which could then reach out to people in metropolitan zones, and we might get a different kind of politics, and that politicians will respond. Part of the issue will be that at the moment, major parties at least tend to recruit from pretty much the same hunting ground, so it's former union officials, ministerial staffers. It's a pretty narrow base who have become very adept at working in the political machine. And maybe, you know, there'll be more citizens who have got broader life experience who might be prepared to make the sacrifice to put themselves forward. We'll just have to see. But I'm optimistic.
Simon, I wanted to ask you, how do you see the change in language occurring? Because here today you've used words, you've talked about the importance of storytelling. My past was in medicine. I looked after sick people. It wasn't a healthcare system.
No.
You know, and so it goes on. And you talked about, I'm not a customer, I'm not a client. How do you see the change occurring?
Well, look, I think it's one of the biggest challenges we've got is that if you notice in our public discourse now, it doesn't matter how serious or grave the problem is, it's ultimately reduced to a question of economic calculation. Every issue, either we're supposed to do it or not to do it based on an assessment by Access Economics. So it's like in the medical world, reducing somebody to being the appendix in bed 24 rather than Simon Longstaff. You know, this kind of thing. I think what's happened is that we've lost our confidence in ethical language of any kind. So just think about it this way to make the contrast clear. Just over 200 years ago, William Wilberforce was arguing against for the abolition of slavery. Can you honestly imagine Wilberforce standing up at the House of Commons at the dispatch box and saying, you know, this is against every element about respect for persons and the intrinsic dignity of the human being, blah, 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 and by the way, I have a report from Access Economics to show that it costs too much, and he slams it down. No, he didn't, because he had an understanding that there was something deeper to which he could appeal than economic calculation. It's not to say you don't look into the economics, it's just that it can't always be the trump card. Let me tell you one of the most disturbing things. Back in 2008, 2009 and again this year, some charities that have been established to combat child abuse actually felt it necessary to go and get an economics report to show that child abuse costs too much. Now come on, you know, what kind of society can't respond to child abuse unless they're convinced it's okay because of economics? Surely it's just wrong. Why can't we just say it's wrong and then go and deal with it? So we need to reclaim a language that talks about values and principles, which gets some confidence, even if we disagree with it, and learn a kind of ethical literacy around these things so that we can talk about things in which economics is part of the consideration, but not the overriding narrative on which all things must be linked. And that's another bit of the invisible stuff. If it doesn't fall within those economic categories, we don't see it, because we say it doesn't really count. So that's how I think I'd go about doing it.
Simon, my name's Jenny O'Connor from Indigo Shire Council.
Hello.
We have just recently, we have just recently agreed to welcome refugees to Indigo Shire. However, there is, understandably, a real concern that people will arrive here and we won't have the mechanisms to support them effectively. We don't have, for example, industry where we can just employ a whole lot of people. So there's, I think, a genuine will to want to help the asylum seekers in particular and refugees, and there's also a genuine concern about how do we do that without adequate support from the government. So what can we as a community do without relying just on what the governments may or may not do to effectively welcome these people to our community?
Well, I don't know the precise details, but all I can say, and I mentioned it before, is that even having spent a relatively brief amount of time in this part of the world, there seems to be an inventiveness and a resilience that, you look at Beechworth, I mean, how many times has it reinvented itself after, you know, one form of calamity or another where things have been closed down or changed? It seems to have a genius for this. But as I said, Kerferd himself, maybe it's something to do with people, that, you know, this willingness to reinvent. So I imagine that things that we have, I can't think about and others haven't even thought about yet in this room, might emerge where you will find the texture of the people who come and those who are here, which enmesh, and something extraordinary might emerge. It might be that there are emerging markets which they can speak to, where they have contacts. It could be some activity around artisanal activities. I mean, one of the interesting things about a globalised world that I've noticed over the last few years began with the emergence of the words hand-cut chips on menus. I was fascinated. Why would anybody go to the trouble of writing hand-cut chips? You know, you'd think it's a potato, for heaven's sake, you know, whether it's been cut by a machine or not. And clearly there was a sense that people were looking for something which wasn't just manufactured but bears the mark of the maker. And you see this now with artisanal beers, some of which I enjoyed last night, breads, things like that. The idea that in a globalised economy where everything is reduced to a standard form, there might be something which is so unusual and distinctive that it's got a value that people will pay for. Maybe that group of people bring something in which feeds exactly into that part of the economy, and it gives it something remarkably different and unique. Well, knowing Beechworth from what I've seen, it'll find that something, and there it'll be, and it'll probably be a huge success.
Simon, we have time for a question over here and then one there, and then I think that's... Okay.
Oh, hello, Simon. My name's Jill Grimman.
Hi.
I'd just like to know, how are we going to get ethics into primary schools? It's very important.
Well, in Victoria, you mean, or anywhere?
Everywhere.
Well, we firstly shouldn't underestimate what our teachers are already doing. I mean, there's a lot that's fantastic about there, and it may not have a capital E ethics name, but virtually any primary school you walk into, there's a strong ethical sense which is being imparted to children. They get very strong values and principles around the school. The teachers incorporate it into their own teaching and often their own personal role modelling. So that is there. The question is, how do we complement what is already there with something which might allow more structure? Now, the curriculum right throughout the education system is incredibly crowded at the moment. We're asking our teachers to do everything for us, and how they manage, I don't know. So I think what we're going to have to do is box clever and look at ways that we can integrate these concerns into the mainstream curriculum by saying, well, you know, what about when you're reading a story? What's the moral of the story? How do we talk about that? What are some of the ways of thinking these things through? So it's not just about the consequences, it might also be about duties or issues of character. And build in these elements. What we've done in New South Wales is a bit different. There's a legal right there for people to attend scripture, and the churches particularly have furiously defended this. And it used to be that if you didn't go, you were required by the government to engage in meaningless activity for up to an hour. And it took us 8 years of argument just to get ethics classes as an option for those who didn't want to sit, you know, twiddling their thumbs. And we're still getting resistance over it. But that's a complement, not an alternative to what's already been done that's good within the schools. So maybe, I don't know, I'm not entirely sure that governments have a lot of interest in their citizens becoming more ethically literate. I suspect they may think it makes life harder rather than easier, so I'm not holding my breath on that.
And we have the last question from over here.
Is this thing working? It is working.
Yeah.
We've been using a lot of words today, and wonderful words. 2 words, the ethics and wisdom. As an ethical nation, do you think it would be wise as a nation for us to introduce the idea of acknowledging our Australian frontier wars in Canberra at the War Museum? Or anything? Is it the time, or is it too early for that?
No, look, for me, I actually think often these things, you can't force them. I think they have their own season. My sense of it is that people are getting pretty used to the idea that, when European settlers turned up in Australia, it wasn't just, oh, hi, welcome, we're here, and sit down, shake hands and let's get on with it. That there was actually a resistance and that there were military forces deployed in order to carve out territory and to bring people to justice. I think it's a really complicated story. I mean, I know that in the early colony of New South Wales, justice, the intention of people like Phillip was to treat everybody in a just manner so that people who killed Aboriginal people were also held to account, just as Aboriginal people who killed settlers. But there were wars and there were massacres and there was resistance. And I think, we'd probably be better off acknowledging that and treating it as best we can as part of our overall history, which is, like every country has elements of complexity. The Americans have managed to do that with their expansion westwards and the very complicated issue of military confrontation with the Indian nations. And I think we should do the same and understand the nature of it. So I wouldn't be afraid of that at all, providing we do it not to make, as long as we don't do it as a political thing, to make a point or something. I think if we do it as a genuine part of acknowledging our history, then that would be fine. I think if it gets politicised for ideological reasons, whichever way, and people use it as a aha kind of gotcha moment, then it would be really unsatisfactory. But if it's a genuine encounter with our history, I'd support it.
Thank you, Simon. I'd now like to invite Jamie O'Callaghan, who is a captain of Beechworth Secondary College, to thank Dr. Longstaff.
On behalf of the community and the audience here today, I'd like to thank you, Dr. Simon Longstaff, for stepping up to present this year's views on the Kerferd Oration topic, the invisible people. We're very fortunate to have someone with such a great deal of experience in ethics and justice to deliver us such interesting food for thought. We greatly appreciate the donation of your time to our community this morning, and I think all of us here can say we're wiser for the experience. I'd also like to take the opportunity to thank the Oration Committee and everyone else who was involved in organising this event. And just in case you're wondering, I counted 12 lights. Thank you.
A very fitting thank you from over here and from Jamie. Thank you. We now come to the Kerferd Medal presentation. The descendants of George Briscoe Kerferd in attendance today have travelled from Mount Tamborine in Queensland and from Melbourne. George Kerferd and his wife Anne, née Martindale, had 10 children. Today, present are 3 great-grandsons. Robert Kirkwood, descended from Joseph, 1871 to 1952. Ian Young, descended from Frederick, 1872 to 1957, and David Kerferd, descended from John, 1877 to 1954. Today also we welcome the next generations, Robert's daughter Nicole and her son London, and David's daughter Georgina and son James, making present today 3 great-grandsons, 3 great-grandsons, 3 great-great-grandchildren, and 1 great-great-great-grandson. Interestingly, the George Briscoe Kerferd Medal was crafted by George Frimmel from Melbourne and has an image adapted from an 1870 print from the Burke Museum collection. Representing the Kerferd family, I invite Nicole, accompanied by her son London, to present the George Briscoe Kerferd Medal.
Is that Thomas?
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Nicole and London, and all the members of the Kerferd family. It is really important that the name of Kerferd lives on in Beechworth and surrounds, and everywhere really, to inspire in us all to be good citizens. The honour board over here shows the eminent speakers from 2003, and today is added the name of Dr. Simon Longstaff, AO. On your behalf, I would like to thank all the people involved in the creation of this year's oration, particularly the committee. They are listed, all the names are listed on your program. Also, a special thank you to the three major financial sponsors, La Trobe University, WAW Credit Union and Indigo Shire Council. We also thank the George Kerferd Hotel. It is right that we return here. This year, instead of the usual evaluation survey, we are asking you to please write your comments on the question cards that you'll find on your seat. These are the cards that have been placed around Beechworth for the last 8 weeks, and there's some on your seat. Do write your comments, and if you are interested in being involved in the Kerferd Oration in the future, please add your contact details. Cards can be placed in a basket over at the door as you leave. As the current manager of Beechworth Neighbourhood Centre, I would like to acknowledge the great work of BNC that's been done for more than 20 years. The 2015 Board of Beechworth Neighbourhood Centre, staff and local community are currently considering how BNC can adapt to a changing world and changing community expectations. Central to these discussions and our resulting action, we must always ask ourselves what is the right thing to do for the Beechworth community. In paying attention to this question and being thoughtful in our response, BNC shall continue to be a place for all people to come together to share food and talk, to think together, to work together, to play together, and to learn together. And in really tough times for people personally or collectively, BNC will not turn away. We shall continue to be there as a focal point for the Beechworth community to connect and to recover. Last year, the Beechworth Red Cross celebrated their centenary of service. Today, members of the Beechworth Red Cross have prepared today's lunch. Please join us in sharing together our community lunch to draw a close to the 13th George Briscoe Kerferd Oration. And before doing, Michael Evans has something he would like to say.
Thank you, Jude. The first thing I'd like to say is, again, thank you, Jude, for the great job that you've done chairing this event. You had a large number of faces to look out over and a large number of questions to respond to. Here's a token of our thank you. And we look forward to your work at the Neighbourhood Centre as you go about reinventing, as Simon has said, one of our newer local institutions. I'd also like to acknowledge the work of one other person who's sitting down in the audience here today, Joan Sims. Thanks for the comments. Without Joan, there would be no Kerferd Oration. Joan organised the first back in 2003. I think it was a birthday present for Beechworth's 150th, if I recollect correctly, and a very appropriate present it was as well, because at the time when George Briscoe Kerferd was here in this town, this was a town where there was a lot of discussion of important events from afar, the war in the Crimea, matters of philosophy, justice and ethics, matters of citizenship, the sorts of things that Kerferd Oration orators have given us, and the sorts of topics that Simon has given us a tour de force on today. And I think that recreating an old Beechworth tradition of discussion and argument, the sort of thing that used to happen in Beechworth Athenaeum, now the main chamber of the Burke Museum. In doing that, Joan has done this town a wonderful service. She's chaired the committee for 11 years and been the guiding force behind chairs Ian McKinlay and myself for the last 2. So thank you, Joan. We do have a small bunch of flowers here to acknowledge you, but we'll get that to you later.